In the start of the Industrial Revolution, emperors encouraged the opening of farmland in uncultivated areas. Roadways and canals were reused, resulting in an expansion of the agricultural base and a huge jump in population. By 1800, the expanding population caused environmental damage, grievances against the government, Qing officials lost control, and citizens began to lose trust in the government. Eventually, the White Lotus Rebellion broke out. This rebellion was ignited by internal conflicts that were focused on social instabilities related to non-approved religions. In order for their economy to flourish and open international markets, Britain negotiated with China to trade. However, they were rejected. In order to find a way to trade, Britain first imported a small amount of opium through illegal purposes. Soon, Chinese officials were addicted to opium, hence the government was so ineffective that they could not deal with the increasing amount of opium that was imported. Opium brought Britain a considerable amount of money, whereas China's economy totally collapsed. In 1839, the Opium War burst out. Britain invaded China with a well-equipped army and powerful navy that was formed in the Industrial Revolution. As a result, China was badly defeated. The Chinese sold many things that European markets were interested in, but for the most part they demanded payment in silver, which greatly complicated the trade. As a solution, the British, observing the demand for opium in China, grew and sold large amounts of opium. They also sold it to intermediaries for silver that would eventually sell it to the Chinese. The balance was off, and the concern of the growing number of Chinese opium addicts led the Chinese government to stop foreign ships, destroy cargoes, and arrest merchants. The British responded violently, and a number of brief but bloody battles were waged, typically with decisive British victories over the numerous Chinese armies. The British people in Qing Empire signed the Treaty of Nanking, what the Chinese later called the Unequal Treaties. From this treaty, Chinese government gave Great Britain the city of Hong Kong and helped the British import more product to China. As the positive results for China, it opened the foreign trade road. After the Opium War, the fluctuations of opium productivity caused by coastal flooding made many people suffer hard lives from planting opium. As a result, social unhappiness and foreign intrusion triggered the Taiping Rebellion that originated in Guangxi. Hong Shui-chuan, who was influenced by Christian teachings, had visions to reform China. Hong encouraged gender equality and Christianity, which attracted many people to form an army that captured Nanjing in 1853. In order to secure their principal objective, Britain and France helped the Qing to fight against the Taipings. The injection of more advanced weaponry quickly slowed down the Taiping Rebellion. In 1854, Taiping Tianguo was defeated by the Qing army. After the rebellion, 20 million to 30 million people died from disease and starvation. The Qing dynasty was so weakened by the rebellion that it was never able to govern effectively over the country. Britain and France decided to renew the war on the Qing in 1856, which is now called the Second Opium War. Britain and France invaded Beijing and took the Summer Palace in 1860. After the loss, more unequal treaties related to economic punishments and trading policies were forced into being signed by the Qing dynasty. Meanwhile, as China was being defeated, Japan was growing their military powers. Due to the Western powers' pressure on China, citizens began an uprising called the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion was a series of anti-foreigner riots that raised concerns about the recent drought that was thought to have been caused by the foreigners. Japan used this opportunity to demonstrate its military power and worked to expand its relations with China. When World War I began, Japan joined the Allied side and used its newfound label to expand by occupying the coast of China. The Chinese then broke out in several boycotts of Japanese goods, creating a struggle between the two countries that lasted almost 30 years. On May 4, 1919, several students had had enough with the Qing Empire and decided to demonstrate in front of the Forbidden City. Although this started as a protest against China's response to the newly signed Treaty of Versailles, it soon encompassed all the concerns and anger that citizens felt towards the government over the years. Students explained how upset and fed up they were with the Qing, and this movement eventually spread through the whole empire. Soon the majority were rebelling and the Qing Empire fell. After the Qing Empire fell, Sun Yat-sen introduced the newly formed Communist Party to China. When he died, leadership was passed to Chiang Kai-shek. Although he allied with the Communist Party, he ended up siding with the gangsters and fighting against the communists. Although he had many administrators, they were incompetent and decided to become officials to get rich, which led to heavy taxing on citizens and more corruption. Overall, this weakened China as a state and made them more vulnerable, ending with Japan invading China in 1936. Before China was faced with industrialization, they faced the Western powers. Instead of letting these powers in, China resisted them, creating a much weaker state. China's economy then declined rapidly. During this time, Europe was a dominant economic and political power. Their military powers were extremely strong, and due to China's isolation compared to the countries in Europe, they were unaware that there were illegal trades going on that affected them badly but brought money to the Europeans. At the time, China was facing several internal troubles such as a declining economy, corruption, and a huge increase of population that could not be handled. On the outside, China was facing the pressure of the Western powers and Japan that ultimately led to the fall of the Qing Empire. The question comes down to, was modernization of China successful? Well, China underwent a failing modernization period after the Opium War. When Chinese authorities were facing their country's mounting crises, a concept dealing with foreigners known as self-strengthening was presented to reinvigorate traditional China. As a result, the Chinese designed an examination system, plus opened a few industrial factories and initiated a telegraph system. However, those ideas were doomed because the factories established were still dependent on foreigners for materials and machinery. Thus, China's ineffective and corrupt government restricted the development of modernization. Overall, the modernization in China was a total failure and ultimately led to the Boxer Uprising, an anti-foreign movement which all ended in an unhappy and corrupt state. If one was to reform the government, economy, military, and religion in China, there would need to be several steps for success. Since China was failing, government needed to confess their inferior position in modern equipment. Learning the Europeans' modernized technologies could have been the best way to change their current condition. In addition, trade internationally would be beneficial to China. They should have traded with the Europeans with Chinese teas in exchange for military weapons. By the time China's economy had recovered, they should have worked to set up several industrial factories that were run only by the Chinese. Meanwhile, China should have consolidated the idea of self-strengthening, specifically in strengthening their army with modernized equipment, and highly encouraging people to be educated. In religious speaking, encouraging more Confucianism ideas in the sake to recover traditional Chinese thinking would have been the best. If China would have allowed the Western powers in ways that would have been beneficial, such as trade for military weapons, modernization would have been more effective. China should have at least cooperated with the Europeans and bargained with them. If they would have been open, Britain would have not started to trade opium illegally. Instead, they would have run it past the Chinese, who would have realized the problem before it was too late. This could have stopped most of the corruption and war that took place during the 19th and 20th centuries. The domino effect created from China's complete resistance of Western powers led to failure. The most important thing to do to change the outcome of China's so-called modernization would be to open trade to Europe, use the tools that are traded into China, and create factories that produce these products. If the government wanted to keep the idea of anti-foreigners, they could boost the education systems for the Chinese and employ them in these factories. This would start the long process of getting China out of a corrupt state and closer to a successfully modernized country.